you know, we have pathologically little appreciation for the complexity of things. We suspect that we ought to have the right to dictate simplicity to the universe. The universe ought to have to meet our terms. It ought to have to speak our language, etc. Well, for several thousand years, human beings were subtle enough to recognize that our language, the terms in which we naturally tend to think, these things are totally artificial. They're conventional. They're fabrications. An imbecile would suppose that the world ought to have to meet the terms that human beings dictate to it. Well, apparently there are a great many more imbeciles nowadays, because the necessity of rising above these artificial media doesn't seem to strike very many people. And philosophy, I mean, I've spoken earlier of the tendency of people to lose their grip on the complexities of their own language. I mean, language is already something artificial. They can't even master that. Well, you need all the complexities there are in the language in order to reach beyond language. They're reducing their world down to a simplistic mechanism, which of course will never be able to reveal anything beyond what they're already preconditioned or trained to comprehend. And the problem is hardly any less great with academics. Philosophy, as any other academic discipline, does business in terms of an accepted professional vocabulary. If you try to monkey with that, if you try to stretch an academic's terminology, they absolutely do not appreciate it, in spite of the fact that virtually every great mind in the philosophical tradition has had to invent his own terms. To, you know, you look at cases like Whitehead. I mean, Whitehead just goes bonkers with neologisms, with invented terminology, because he sees so much more. Husserl is another. Hegel is notorious for this. Excuse me.
Yeah.
The necessity of working plastic changes on language in order to get it to conform better to the logic of nature and history is just inevitable. You can't think about much without seeing that language has severe limitations. Well, we inhabit our artificialisms more myopically than any other people. This is the modern labyrinth. We're caught in a maze of our own devising, from which we will not permit ourselves to search, to explore, to try and find alternatives. Eventually, I mean, the same thing that happens in individual lives that deplete their resources of meaningfulness, just like depleting the oxygen in a room. Eventually, human beings fall into despair. They fall into depression, despondency, etc., over the sheer feeling that they're trapped, they're captives in something, and they don't even have the power to dictate or determine what it is, because that is what the trap is. Kierkegaard, brilliant little formula, said, a delusion is a state of mind in which one is least able to think of what one most needs to think. That's the insane logic of every narrow-minded perspective. Human beings build labyrinths simply in the process of thinking incompetently. They commit themselves to a logic from which then they don't know how to save themselves. And it didn't occur to them when they started building this thing that maybe they ought to leave a way out. Every culture that doesn't have a sufficiently invigorating and self-challenging sense of the mysteries of existence is going to fall prey to that kind of closed-mindedness. we have a much narrower, more impoverished cultural base to work with than traditional cultures. And therefore, the possibility of individuals liberating themselves from this culture is a much more desperate task, I think. Our educational system is not really of much significant use in this regard. Our educational system exists in order to train people. You know, it's trying to recruit people for the industrial army, and not to try and liberate their minds so that
Right.
they can think, they can be free, they can see the way things are.
Well, you taught history of philosophy and history of existentialism as well.
Yeah.
Anything? What else did you teach?
Ethic. Oh gosh, I've
ethical.
taught all across the political philosophy, philosophy and literature, every conceivable subject. I'm
And they all
very fortunate.
And they all have their things to say about. Do you have any favorite that particular that you thought the students reacted to particularly strongly?
Well, the courses I've felt most that they most successfully or most symphonically drew the themes into a strong, coherent presentation were existentialism. And my students seem to think that the one time I taught a seminar on nihilism as part of the honors program, and we went through Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and out of what ancient archetypes and precursors modern nihilism took its bearings. The students who went on to become whatever professionals, of whether they were professors, librarians, in the foreign service, etc., they seemed to feel that that course did more to them to get their feet on the ground in terms of what modern culture was doing to us. I mean, to study Dostoevsky just by himself is an education, but to have to recast those issues so that you feel the bite of the kinds of things Nietzsche is saying at the same time.
I see, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, every successful course in philosophy to me is learning how to make controlled analogies from one thinker's perspective to another's. And to some extent, there's a problem here, somewhat like comparative anatomy or whatever. I mean, the foot of a rabbit and the foot of a horse, I mean, they are in some sense analogs. And if you understand the mechanism, you know, the sort of purpose, they're supposed to be serving a human foot by the same token. You understand something analogically that can't really be understood literally or mechanically.
Right.
Well, the same thing is true if you understand the ultimate purposes and principles of any philosopher's or writer's point of view. If you've understood his work that way, then you're in a position to map his thinking on top of the thinking of another thinker who's approached similar
Is that
issues.
a matter of comparing and contrasting the two, or is it picking out the best parts of both and sort of syncretizing them together?
It is both. You do have to have what I would call a circumspect perspective. You have to be looking beyond just the things that a philosopher has said to the issues that these things seem to be about. If you read Marx and all you see are sentences and words, instead of the portrait of a kind of world. I mean, Marx is describing what is really a Gothic horror story. He's describing economic Nazism. You know, what happens when the economy becomes a totalitarian methodology that will not permit the world to make any other kind of sense or logic but its own. And Nietzsche is, you know, if you just look at Marx, just in terms of the literal surface logic of what he says, what is expressly articulated there, you wind up with a claptrap of technicalities and terminology and so forth. All of these theories require that you look beyond them to the world that they're trying to triangulate on. And then you'll find principles and arguments that they have in common, perspectives that there's a certain kind of family resemblance among their approaches. Some elements that they have in common because they've had common influences out of the tradition. But these things only become apparent when you use philosophy as a language for trying to see the logic of the way the world works.
Mm-hmm.